In part one of our Bible context, I asked the question, what is the Bible? Is it just a mythology? Is it just philosophies? Or what is it? And I mentioned the translation issues, to which they say the typical man, the typical reader can understand. Now, what do they mean also when they say that? For I had read the Old Testament, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, and I did put it into context, not only on the spiritual side of it, but also the physical side of it, of where and when Moses wrote that Bible, that version of what he saw. For when he saw that, he was with his assistant Joseph, he was with his prophet Aaron, and Aaron had his own prophet, his own assistant with him, and 70 other elders saw this with him. And so in that same book of Exodus 24, in verses 9 and 10, it says that they saw Elohim, and Elohim sat and ate with them. He sat and ate and drank with them. In another version, says they had a covenant meal. And while they did that, it says that Elohim, under his feet, was a pavement of crystal blue sapphire, a pavement of sapphire, which is the sky itself, which means that the Lord, the Elohim, our Father, his feet rest on the earth, and the earth is his resting feet. That is why when Moses gives a description of the second verse in Genesis chapter 1, he says, the earth was desolate, the waters were deep, and they created a darkness. But the spirit of Elohim was hovering over the water, as would a boy or girl who has a hoverboard, a skateboard, a roller skate would skate and roll or hover over whatever is beneath thy feet. Now, back into the context. First things first, we have a challenge as, number one, as an African, I speak my home language, which is the Zulu language. Now, when I speak Zulu, the issue is that my Bible and my Zulu Bible translates from English. The question is, where does the English translation come from? And are there any translations that were lost in translation, like a broken telephone? Was there anything related to that? So now a lot of us do not read the notes before the actual book. So many printed Bibles have notes before, where the translators give you the context and their idea of what they are writing. So now for us to go back and re-explain and explain more the book of Exodus, we first need to understand the context of what was happening, which means we have a challenge as the African people, to which we have to diffuse the conception, the perceptions of not only the translator, but four different conceptions. This is what they say. We have converted ancient weights and measures to modern English American equivalents, since the ancient measures are not generally meaningful to today's readers. Then in the textual footnotes, we offer the literal Hebrew, Aramaic, or Greek measures, along with modern metric equivalents. So as an African, I have to worry about the modern metric equivalents, the Greek measures, the Aramaic measures, and then go into the literal Hebrew. But now there's even an issue where the Hebrew is not the actual name and language of the people. For if you look up the name of the people on earth, you look for Hebrew, it will only take you as far as the Igbo tribes in Ghana. So we have an issue where we need to put everything into context. First, literal context and the context of the translators. We need to move beyond the Aramaic translation, the Greek measure and conception, and the metric or symmetric measures, which is the new messianic versions, the new Hebrew, as of instead of reading directly from the Old Testament, because of they saying that they are doing their best to make sure that we can have a meaningful reading. Now, instead of translating ancient accuracy values literally, we have expressed them in common terms. So instead of literally explaining what was and what is and is to come, they said it's better to put it in a common contextual perception. So now that is the challenge we have. Okay, so when we read the book of Exodus chapter 24, verses 1 and 2, and also jumping to verses 9, 10, and 11, then we find that Elohim did not only invite them, but he gave them an audience in the heavens. They saw his presence and he did not destroy them. As much as we know that Moses once said, Elohim, I would like to see your face, for I have been talking to you, but I've never seen your face. And then Elohim said, no one sees me and lives to tell it. To which in the scientific version, they say that the sun is so hot that anyone who goes close to see it will not survive, to which you would die, which is a definition of what Elohim said to Moses. So science in its own context takes things from the literal context of the creation and the story of creation. So there are things in science that when they speak of them, they sound different. But if you're a wise, intellectual, spiritual person, you'll understand and see a connection that one of the two copied from the other. We'll go into that a little more later. So now, Exodus 24, verses 9, which is where we ended, it says, Then Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel climbed up the mountain. There they saw Elohim of Israel. Under his feet there seemed to be a surface of brilliant blue lapis lazuli, which is under the surface of brilliant blue crystal pavement of sapphire, as clear as the sky. Another version says, as clear as the body of heaven. Now in Genesis 1, Moses said, Elohim created the earth and the heaven, or vice versa. So now the body of heaven is spoken of in here, where the feet of heaven are resting and hovering upon the surface of the deep waters. And in the deep waters, what was what? It was covering the pavement, the earth. So when Moses spoke of this, he was speaking of something he literally saw. Interesting enough, 70 other people witnessed this. Aaron and his assistant witnessed this. Joseph himself, as the assistant of Moses, witnessed this. So now my challenge here with the biblical conception or the biblical context, the heading and the topic of my series, is that Elohim is putting everything to which we call idols, to which we call worship, into a test. For he himself did not test himself, but he provided evidence of himself. Now, as much as we are putting the Bible into context, we must not only know that Moses wrote these 5 books, but we must also know when and where what was happening so that we can understand. It is like putting yourself in the shoes of Moses, so that what he wrote does not only make sense spiritually, but makes sense literally. For the book of the Romans, chapter 1, around verses 13 onwards going down, it says that Elohim made both things of the spirit and of the physical, so that no one will have an excuse. He showed his supreme power in its physical state and in its spiritual state, so that no one will have an excuse. That is why the Messiah said, if these people who are my people stop worshiping me, the stones will worship. So the stone is a physical essence of what the spirit represents. So nothing is only as it is. That's why sometimes there are examples in the Bible that are physical, like nature, the tree, or the vineyard. But now, this is the case that Elohim is putting. This is his perspective now of the Bible, to which I'm about to reveal, so that you can understand why Moses wrote what he wrote. And not only what he wrote, why Moses wrote the perception of Elohim and also what he saw with his own eyes along with the other elders. And in the book of Isaiah 41, verses 21, the Lord presents his case. And he says that, present the case of your idols, says Elohim. Let them show what they can do, says the King of Israel. Let them try to tell us what happened long ago, so that we may consider the evidence, or let them tell us what the future holds, so we can know what's going to happen. So now, if you read this carefully, so Elohim is saying that with any idols out there, in any worship, you must provide the evidence and state your case. You must try to tell us what happened long ago, and so that we may consider the evidence. Or you must also try to tell us the future. So now, reading the book of Genesis is us understanding the beginning and why it was read and written from Moses, and also in the perception of Elohim. The Bible